and welcome back to my channel. Today we're going to do a how-to video on dry lining. Dry lining is the process of putting plasterboards onto walls or ceilings, which is the reason I'm assuming you clicked on this video, because you all know how to do it. There's a couple of ways that you can attach plasterboard to a surface. You can either stud the wall out with battens and then you can screw the boards directly onto there. This will allow you to put a layer of insulation between the battens, which is good if you want to internally insulate your house. Or if you're boarding ceilings, you just screw them straight to your joists. But this tutorial is going to cover the dot and dab method, which is the method using plasterboard adhesives, where you stick the board to the wall and level it up with a series of levels and straight edges. But I hear you screaming, Jinga, how do we get started? So first of all, I'm going to cover equipment and materials, and then we're going to move on to surface preparation, and then onto the actual dry lining itself. Let's go. Right, so to kick off equipment then, we're going to start off with probably the most important tools, levels and a straight edge, or plasterer's derby as they're sometimes known. You're going to want a small level for any smaller boards you want to level up. I'm using a 600 level. I've got a big 6 foot yellow level there, and this is a feather edge, straight edge. This can be used for floating, screeding, but generally you're going to want that to help straighten the boards when they're on the wall. Moving on to hand tools then, we've got a bucket trowel. If you looked at my last video, my bucket trowel was in a bit of a sorry state for itself, but I've got another one, so that's going to come in handy. You're going to need a plasterer's hawk to obviously put your plasterboard adhesive on when you get it out of the bucket. And you're also going to need an adequate trowel to actually put the adhesive on the wall. I'm using a 16-inch Marshalltown one. It's important that you use a trowel that you're not bothered about ruining, because these edges do rub against the brick or the surface you're applying the adhesive to, and it will wreck your trowel. And to go along with the hand tools, I'm going to go ahead and include a pair of gloves in here. Like a lot of plastering materials, plasterboard adhesive, if it gets on your skin, it will dry it out and you'll start having skin irritations. And we've also got a hop up here hiding in plain sight. You're going to want that to reach the top edges of your wall. You're also going to need a pad saw to cut any electrical boxes out, a Stanley knife and tape measure to cut the plasterboard. And then we're going to move on to the last but not least, the buckets. So we're going to have a flexi tub. This is the one where you're going to mix the adhesive in, and you're going to have another small bucket there. That's going to be used to rinse your equipment and trowels off. And before I leave it out, you're also going to want to have a mixing drill. This is going to be used to mix your adhesive up. Make sure you get one that's decent and can handle it. This stuff gets pretty thick when you mix it up. So getting a decent mixer that won't burn out is pretty important. Now we've got the equipment covered, we're going to move on to materials. This one's pretty simple, you'll be glad to know. All we're going to need is some plasterboard adhesive. I'm using Knauf. No one knows how to pronounce it, but everyone tries. And you're going to need plasterboards to put on the wall. And last but not least, for materials, good old PVA. We use tons of stuff for this in plastering, so it's good to have some of that lying about. So now you've got your tools and equipment, we can move on to the preparatory works. Getting the wall ready to have the plasterboard adhesive on it, and subsequently the plasterboards. So step one is probably measuring up. This is important, you get this right. It'll cost you extra money if you don't know how to do it. Make sure you do your measurements in metres, because if you live in the UK, these are pretty easy to convert to the plasterboard sizes. And when you've got your width and your height, you're going to multiply the numbers together. This is going to give you your square metre of area. When you're plasterboarding anything, good practice is to have the least amount of joints that you can. This is going to help minimise the potential cracks that could occur with the plasterboards. And to help you out, because I'm feeling generous, I'll put these sizes on the screen somewhere for the square meterage of each plasterboard. So if you're using 8x4 plasterboards, there's 2.88 square meters in those boards. So if you've got 10 square meters of wall area, you want to divide your 10 square meters by 2.88, and that number will tell you how many boards you've got to get. For example, if the number comes out 8.67 something or other, get 9 boards. Now that we've got all the mind-boggling maths out the way, let's take a look at the wall and actually see what we need to do to start. Okay, so here is the wall that I'm going to be working on for this video. It's important to note what surface you're actually sticking the boards to. As you can see, mine is just old brick, which was under solid sand and cement plaster before. So mine's a little bit more dusty and has a lot more mortar content in it. You can pretty much plasterboard onto most surfaces except for anything that's too smooth. So don't think about plasterboarding over tiles. You don't want to do any of that. Either take the tiles off, or you can put blue grit on to prime the surface to give it a mechanical key. So then your boards will actually stand a chance at sticking to the tile. And don't dot and dab plasterboards onto surfaces that are flexible or likely to move, meaning if it's anything plastic or if it can move too much when you touch it. Or don't plasterboard onto anything that's too flexible, such as any flimsy surfaces or even wood. Wood is an expandable material dependent on the moisture, which means it expands and contracts where moisture is present. So if you put plasterboard adhesive on wood or anything that moves, when that thing moves, your plasterboard adhesive is not flexible and it won't, and more than likely the bond will break and then your plasterboard will come off the wall. And going back to smooth surfaces such as tiles, if you are plasterboarding onto a smooth surface, just use blue grit. It's a priming agent with aggregate in that will dry to the smooth surface and will leave a rough texture, and then you can plasterboard onto that. Think of it as if you wet your finger and run it down a piece of glass, you'll find it'll slide really easily. If you wet your finger and try and slide it down a brick wall, you won't get very far. That's the same principle with adhesive. So if it's not got a decent mechanical key to actually stick to, it's going to come off. Okay, so back to the wall again. If it's a new build, you might be dry lining onto maybe concrete blocks or breeze blocks, in which case surface preparation is pretty minimal. You can go ahead and skip this part of surface prep and just go straight to plasterboarding. However, like I said, I've got an old brick wall with a high mortar content. If you've watched my last video on how to plaster, the way I explain it is it's kind of like a sponge. So there's microscopic pores all over this surface that will just suck moisture out as soon as it hits it. I'll prove this to you by putting some water on the wall. Now that you've seen how fast water soaks into the wall, it wouldn't be a good idea to put wet adhesive on the wall. The moisture will be just sucked straight out of it. It'll cause the compound to dry too quick and then it'll come off the wall. Think of it as like a desert when you get rain and then it dries super quick and it leaves all cracked mud. That's pretty much what happens to your plaster if it dries too quick. So if you've got a surface like this wall where it's got a lot of mortar on it, or if it's concrete, I'd recommend probably PVAing it first. So we're going to mix the PVA up with 1 part PVA and maybe 5 parts water. It doesn't have to be a strong mix, just enough to slow the suction down. Plasterboard adhesive won't dry as fast as plaster does when it's exposed to dry surfaces, so you have a bit more wiggle room with your PVA. Not only is PVA good to control the suction, but it also creates a chemical bond with the plasterboard adhesive and gets rid of all the dust off the wall surface, giving you a better bond to the wall with the adhesive. So with the wall PVA, we can go ahead and mix our plasterboard adhesive. I tend to use around half a bucket of water in a flexi tub, and that'll generally take up 1 bag of that. You may need to add a bit of additional compound if it's a bit too much water, but you do use this stuff up pretty quickly, so it's worth mixing up a big amount when you start. Best guidance is whatever bag you choose, just make sure that you follow the mixing ratios on the back, as that's going to give you the best results. Once it's mixed up, you're looking for this kind of texture where you can move it and it doesn't slump and it kind of holds its shape. That's the ideal texture you want. It means it's going to be workable, but it's not just going to fall flat when it goes on your wall. Once your adhesive's mixed up, it's worth getting your 6 foot level and checking the level of your wall and looking for parts where you might have to add more or less adhesive. Now the level on my wall isn't too bad. It's out about 20 millimeters at the top compared to the bottom. You don't really want to take this adhesive thicker than maybe 3/4 of an inch. As it starts to go thicker, you'll find it'll come off the wall a lot easier. So the tighter you can get these boards against the wall, the better the bond will be. If your wall is out, you might need to put a coat of sand and cement on the wall just to try and straighten it up a little bit, and then dry line your boards onto that. So I'm going to show you the pattern that we're going to use when we're applying our adhesive to the wall. So if you imagine that this is our wall, nice and square and straight lines, our adhesive is going to form what's called a frame around the wall. So it's going to be a solid line of adhesive around all the edges. This frame is going to be used for fire protection. So if there's ever a fire, if it gets behind the plasterboards, it can't get past this point into this hollow and go upstairs. With the frame, you're also going to do dot and dabs every 300 millimeters apart. The reason for that is when we dry line, screws should be 300 millimeters apart. So generally try and do your dots around the same. It's going to give a firm grip on your board and make sure that it's not flapping about once it's on the wall. So ideally on that entire wall, that's what your plasterboard adhesive will look like. Obviously that wall will be made of a couple of plasterboards. So that's the principle of what the adhesive does on the wall behind the plasterboards if you could strip the boards away. Obviously we're only doing one board at a time, so I'm going to show you how to do that now. It's really important that your first board that you put on the wall is plumb and straight, because this is going to set the level for the rest of the wall. So you can actually use that board once it's plumb and straight to plumb the others up, so you don't have to spend too long on the levels and trying to get it all right. So the first thing you want to do is get your adhesive out of the bucket, prime your hawk with it so it doesn't slip off, and then get ready to put it on the wall. The technique for applying this is once you've got a little bit on your trowel, it's kind of like a flicking of the wrist motion. Use a full length of the trowel to put a good decent amount on there. Once you've completed your frame around the wall, you can start doing the dot and dabs in the middle of the plasterboard. You'll notice that by using the technique of flicking your wrists, it creates a peak on the adhesive, and it's actually these peaks that allow you to level the board up because it creates a tolerance for it to go closer or further away from the wall. Also, when you're putting your plasterboards down, make sure you put packers underneath them. These are simply just a piece of plasterboard that's cut in half. It raises the board off the ground, and this means that if you have got any damp on the floor, it doesn't work its way up the board and you start getting damp walls. So it's really important that you put packers underneath your board when you're putting them on the wall. Once your adhesive's on the wall, gently push your board so it engages the adhesive, and then use your feather edge or straight edge along with your level to gently hit the board level. Try and get out all the little dips and bows in the board. When it comes to doing your door frame details, I've got a short door frame for my wall. If you're doing it onto maybe a new build, you might have the door frames already in which case if they do stick out past the brickwork, you can set your plasterboards to that. But because I've got a recessed door frame, it means I'm going to have to put a reveal piece in here to make a corner. It's something worth bearing in mind before you start plasterboarding the wall and figuring out where your walls are going to end up. As far as dry lining is concerned, they're the fundamental principles you should use when you're dry lining a wall. I'm going to cover what to do over electrical boxes in a moment, but I'm just going to show you this. So some of the things to look out for when your wall is dot and dabbed on. Make sure that when you cast your eye down it, your ceiling line is going to be nice and straight again all the way down the wall, and again on the floor make sure it's in a nice straight line. This is important because it's going to affect how your walls look, especially in the corners. If one of the boards dip in slightly, when it's all finished it's going to look a little bit wavy. And as for the skirting boards, if your line isn't actually straight, when you put your skirting board on, you'll notice it'll dip in or come out. So once you finish the wall, make sure you cast your eye down it, check that there's a nice straight line on all of the edges. So I'm going to show you a nice little trick now of what to do over electrical boxes that are on the wall. So if they're the metal mattresses that have been screwed straight to the wall, put your packers in place where your board is going to sit. And then a nice little trick is you can use your packer for this or any little offcuts of board. But if you get your board and you just scrape it onto the box, make sure you go all the way around the box, getting good coverage on this front edge. And what that's going to do is chalk up the front of the box. So once our plasterboard's cut to size and we test it against the wall, we're going to put it in front of our pattress. We're going to tap it lightly with our hand. When we pull the board away, it's going to have a nice white box, and then it shows us exactly where we've got to get the plasterboard saw and cut our box out. So as you can see from the box being marked out, we now have an impression, and from that impression we can get our plasterboard saw and we can just start to cut this shape out. When it's all cut out and we stick it on the wall, it should fit over this box perfectly. So I've put the adhesive on the wall and the board is now on. As you can see, the socket box is perfectly cut out. So the issue I've got is that my wall is so out of level that this bottom half needed to go in a lot, which means my electrical box is now sticking out a little bit. But nonetheless, I can swap that out for a more slimline one. But you can see how marking the box gives you a nice tight shape around it, and it's not leaving any gaps for the plasterer to fill afterwards. And that is it, guys. A pretty simple process really, but I hope you've learned the little tips and tricks to get it done properly. Like a lot of plastering, it's all practice, practice, practice. If you've got a small area to try this out on, absolutely go for it. And if you want to go the full 9 yards and plaster it as well, I'll put a suggestion around the screen somewhere for my how to plaster video. Go take a look at that, that'll show you what you need to do next. And if you've got any questions, just drop them in the comments and I'll try my best to answer everything. And also if you've got any video suggestions, so if you want to see any more how-tos, whether it's plastering or anything else, I'm going to try my best and I'll see if I can get something out for you. So yeah, thanks for watching. Subscribe if you like it, maybe. And yeah, suggest some videos and I'll see you next time.